The rain came without warning, one of those sudden mountain downpours that feels less like weather and more like punishment. I'd been hiking the ridge trail above Laurel Creek, alone, chasing the last bit of daylight to reach my camp by the water. The sky had been grey for hours, but when it broke, it did so with fury. Sheets of cold rain slashed through the trees, and before I could even dig for my poncho, the world turned to water. The trail, slick with pine needles, offered no grip. One misstep on a wet route and I was tumbling, arms flailing, pack dragging me down the slope. I remember the impact with the creek's edge, then the instant shock as I plunged into the freezing current. I scrambled to shore, lungs heaving, drenched to the bone. My fingers felt wooden, already losing their dexterity in the cold. The rain didn't stop. It grew heavier, hammering the forest floor, pooling in my boots. I dug into my pack for my lighter, the one thing I trusted most. The flint wheel was soaked. I tried the electric igniter next. Dead. Water had gotten into everything. Panic crept in, sharp and electric. Hypothermia isn't dramatic when it comes. It's quiet, creeping. A soft numbness that makes bad decisions sound reasonable. I needed fire. I dumped my pack's contents beneath a leaning cedar, searching for anything dry. The forest was drenched, every twig slick, every leaf dripping. I found a few birch branches and started peeling the bark. The paper-thin curls might catch a spark if I could coax one. My fingers trembled as I dug out my ferro rod, the one I kept as backup, but rarely used. I struck it once. Nothing. Again, sparks, but no flame. The birch curls smoked and hissed, but refused to light. I could see my breath now, each exhale heavier, slower. The thought crossed my mind that I might not make it through the night if I didn't get heat soon. I huddled closer to the little pile, shivering so hard my teeth ached. Then I remembered the cattails I'd seen near the creek bend earlier that afternoon. Their seed fluff, dry inside even in rain, could be tinder. I stumbled back toward the water, my boots sinking into cold mud. Kneeling in the reeds, I tore apart a few heads, my hands clumsy but desperate. The fluffy core came free like silk. I stuffed it into my hat, shielding it from the rain as best I could, and stumbled back to the cedar. The cattail fluff, mixed with thin curls of birch and a few shavings from my knife handle, made a pitiful little nest of tinder. My breath came fast and shallow as I struck again, 1, 2, 3 times. On the fourth, a spark caught. A wisp of orange flickered, then died. I cursed under my breath, struck again. The ferro rod screamed against the back of my knife. Then a faint glow. I bent close, whispering through chattering teeth, blowing gently. The flame licked, caught, then began to spread like a heartbeat. For a long moment, I just stared at that tiny flame, no bigger than the head of a match, and felt more relief than I can put into words. The rain hissed as it struck the hot birch bark, threatening to drown it, but I cupped both hands around it like I was guarding the last ember of life itself. I fed it the smallest scraps I could find. Birch curls, cattail fluff, a few thin pine shavings I carved off my pack's frame. The flame fought, stuttered, caught again. Each flicker felt like a small victory against the cold that was tightening its grip on me. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely control them, but the fear kept me moving. When the fire finally reached the size of a golf ball, I eased in slivers of bark no thicker than a matchstick. The rain continued to pound the forest, and smoke coiled up around my face. Thick and acrid, it burned my throat, but I welcomed it. It meant heat. It meant hope. I crouched so low that my knees pressed into the wet soil, my breath blowing on that ember until it flared bright and fierce. The birch bark's oils finally caught, crackling to life, and suddenly the fire wasn't fighting anymore. It was alive. I needed more fuel, and fast. I tore through the undergrowth, looking for anything that might burn. Beneath the cedar's low branches, I found a layer of half-dry twigs that had been shielded from the worst of the storm. I gathered them by the armful, ignoring the way my fingers screamed from the cold. My clothes clung to me, heavy and useless, dripping water into my boots. The forest smelled of wet earth and smoke, raw, primal, and somehow comforting in its misery. Back at the fire, I built a small teepee of twigs and coaxed the growing flame into it. The fire sputtered, then roared, low and angry but strong. I let out a sound, somewhere between a laugh and a sob. My face felt like ice, but I could feel warmth radiating toward me now, licking against my numb hands. Steam began to rise from my jacket as it dried. I peeled it off and hung it on a low branch, the heat stinging my skin as blood slowly returned to my fingers. The rain softened to a drizzle, and the woods seemed to exhale with me. I sat close to the fire, feeding it carefully, afraid that if I looked away, it might die again. My knife lay beside me, its blade dull from scraping sparks, and I felt a strange gratitude toward it, as if it were an old friend that had just pulled me back from the edge. The firelight reflected on the wet bark of nearby trees, throwing ghostly patterns into the darkness. In that moment, I understood how thin the line really is, between control and panic, between comfort and survival. One spark, one mistake, and everything changes. I leaned back, soaked and shaking, but alive, listening to the hiss of the rain and the slow, steady heartbeat of the fire I'd fought to bring into the world. Once the fire steadied into a good, solid burn, I began the slow process of reclaiming myself from the cold. My fingers throbbed painfully as circulation returned, and I could finally unlace my boots, each motion stiff, deliberate. Steam poured off them when I set them beside the flames, and I wrung out my socks, watching the water hiss and dance off the coals. My toes were white, almost waxy, but as I rubbed them and held them near the warmth, colour began to return. That sight alone brought a rush of relief stronger than the fire's heat. The rain tapered to a mist. I could hear the creek running just below, swollen now, its current a low roar beneath the trees. The forest smelled sharp, wet moss, charred birch, and smoke mingling in the air. Every breath felt heavy with life, as if the woods themselves were drawing in with me. I gathered a few larger branches, splitting some with my knife, and a flat stone, and fed the fire until it was the size of a small pit. My clothes steamed like an old kettle, each puff of vapour curling upward into the night. When I finally sat still, fatigue hit like a wave. The cold had drained me, not just from my body, but from my thoughts. I felt hollowed out, reduced to instinct. There was no more plan, only the fire, the sound of rain, and the steady rhythm of survival. I chewed a bit of jerky, barely tasting it, and kept one hand close enough to feel the heat soak into my bones. It wasn't comfort exactly, more like the raw awareness that comfort was possible again. I thought about how easily it all could have gone differently. A bad fall, a spark that refused to catch, a little more wind, and this fire would have been nothing but smoke and failure. I'd been careless leaving camp so late in the day, overconfident in my gear, my lighter, my electronic starter, tools I'd relied on without a thought, had failed the moment nature tested them. But this simple rod of steel and a handful of stubborn effort had saved me when nothing else could. I found myself talking softly to the flames, thanking them like an old friend. It felt foolish, but also right. The fire had its own small voice now, crackling and sighing in rhythm with the rain. I shifted closer, my back against a log, the heat washing over me. For the first time that night, I wasn't shivering. My eyelids grew heavy and I knew I couldn't sleep. Not yet. But I let myself rest, feeling the pulse of warmth spread through my chest. Out there, alone in the drenched wilderness, I realized something simple and fierce. The fire wasn't just keeping me alive, it was proof that I still could fight. As the night deepened, the forest settled into that strange breathing quiet that comes after a storm. The rain finally stopped altogether, leaving behind a silver mist that clung low to the ground. Drops still fell from the trees in steady rhythm, like the ticking of a slow clock. My fire, my fragile, hard-won fire, glowed steady now, the flames orange and alive against the dark. I fed it a thicker log, one that hissed and popped as the moisture burned off, and the sparks rose into the mist like a tiny galaxy. I took stock of my gear. Everything was damp, some things soaked beyond hope. My sleeping bag was half wet, but near the fire it began to dry enough that I could use it later. I hung my shirt and pants on a stick tripod to steam in the heat. The smell of smoke soaked into everything, that sweet, bitter scent that clings for days, but I didn't care. Smoke meant survival, it meant heat. My hands were still stiff, my muscles sore from the fall. I checked the small scrape on my forearm. Nothing serious. The bigger wound was to my confidence. I'd been camping since I was a kid, thought I knew the forest well enough to trust my instincts, yet nature always finds a way to humble you. One slip, one storm, and all the layers of preparation peel back until you're left with nothing but willpower and luck. I knelt to feed the fire again, my movement slower now, deliberate. The flames reflected in the puddles at my feet, tiny dancing twins. I thought about the cattail fluff, the birch bark, the small miracles of the woods that I'd overlooked before tonight. I'd passed them 100 times on hikes, never giving them more than a glance. But when everything else failed, modern gear, convenience, even confidence, it was those simple things that made all the difference. Nature had provided just enough to keep me alive. A cold breeze slipped through the trees, but it didn't bite the same way now. My body had regained some warmth, and the fire's circle of light felt like a living barrier. Beyond it, the forest stretched on, black, dripping, whispering. The creek murmured just out of sight, swollen and restless, carrying the storm's fury away downstream. I could almost imagine the cold water still waiting there, patient and unbothered, ready to take me again if I slipped. I sat back on my heels and watched the firelight flicker across the cedar trunk. Steam curled off the bark, and somewhere far off an owl called, low and soft like a note of approval. The wilderness had tested me, and I'd barely passed, but I'd earned this warmth. I wrapped the half-dry sleeping bag around my shoulders, and for the first time since falling into that creek, I felt the edge of peace returning. The fire burned low by dawn, a bed of red coals pulsing softly in the grey light. Mist hung thick in the trees, and everything beyond the clearing was washed in silver and shadow. My clothes were dry enough to wear, still warm from the night's heat, and I could move without the deep ache of cold that had seized me before. I stirred the embers gently with a stick, feeding them a few dry twigs I'd stashed under the cedar. The flames rose again, slow and sure, like an old friend waking beside me. I brewed a small tin of creek water, boiled it with a bit of pine needle for taste. The steam smelled sharp and clean, almost sweet. Each sip filled me with something I hadn't felt since before the storm, calm. I could finally think clearly again, without that gnawing fear in the back of my mind, whispering about time and temperature and mistakes. I looked at the ferro rod lying on the damp earth, blackened at the edges from use. It wasn't much to look at, but it had been the one tool that didn't care about batteries or weather, just skill, patience, and persistence. When I stood, my knees cracked, and the world around me seemed impossibly alive. The forest floor glistened. The air carried that after-rain scent, earth, pine, smoke, and renewal. The creek ran high, its surface smooth as glass where the current slowed. It was hard to believe that just hours earlier, that same water had been trying to pull me under. I walked to its edge, crouched, and dipped my fingers in. Cold, but not cruel anymore, just part of the balance. Back by the fire, I packed what was left of my gear. The damp sleeping bag, the knife dulled from scraping sparks, the bits of birch bark that had saved me. I kept them all close. When the last coal dimmed, I spread the ashes and buried the evidence of my struggle beneath wet soil. The forest didn't need a monument to my fear. It already remembered, in its own quiet way. Before leaving, I looked once more at the clearing, the charred ring, the leaning cedar, the mist curling upward where my fire had lived. I realized that survival wasn't about conquering nature, it was about listening to it, trusting that even in its harshness, it offers what you need if you have the will to see it. As I hiked back toward the trail, the morning sun broke through in faint golden beams. They touched the ground like blessings, glinting on every leaf and drop of water. My breath rose white in the chill air, and each step felt lighter. I'd come close to the edge that night, and the forest had reminded me just how thin that line is between comfort and peril, warmth and frost, life and silence. But I'd also learned that sometimes one spark one stubborn flicker of light is all you really need to find your way back.